My stepmother shoved me into the china cabinet at my stepsister's birthday dinner. The wine glass shattered at my feet while 8 witnesses watched in silence. "That seat belongs to my actual daughter," Tiffany announced, her voice carrying across the room. "You can stand in the corner and be grateful you were invited at all." I straightened slowly, brushing glass from my sleeve, feeling something ancient and tired finally snap clean inside my chest. What she didn't know was that my father had never trusted her. And the documents I'd found 3 days ago would prove her right to fear that distrust. Before I tell you how I destroyed her world, drop your name and location below. I feature subscribers as characters in every story. And hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Let me take you back to how this all started. I moved into the annex apartment behind my father's house when I was 24. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, just a place to land while I built my freelance marketing business. Close enough to help out, far enough to feel like my own space. Then my father got sick, pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. He lasted 14 months, and during those 14 months, I convinced myself I was doing my part by paying bills and handling paperwork from the annex. Tiffany handled the rest, the doctor's appointments, the medication schedules, the long nights when his breathing turned shallow and ragged. She reminded me of this constantly, not with accusations, but with sighs. With the way she'd look at me when I walked in, like I was a guest who'd overstayed a visit. "Your father asked for you last night," she'd say, her voice soft as velvet. "But I told him you were busy with work. I didn't want him to feel like a burden." She never yelled. She never had to. Her silence was a scalpel, precise and bloodless. But Tiffany wasn't always like this. A memory came to me, sharp and bittersweet, from when I was 13 years old. My mother had passed away 2 months before, and Tiffany had just married my father. I was sitting in my room on what would have been my mother's 42nd birthday, crying into my pillow, trying to be quiet so no one would hear. The door opened softly, and Tiffany sat down on the edge of my bed. She didn't say anything at first, just placed her hand on my back and let me cry. When I finally looked up, she pulled me into her arms. "I'll never replace your mother," she said quietly. "But I'll always be here for you, Cassie. I promise you that." I believed her then. I really did. That was 17 years ago, before always became until it's inconvenient. Before promises turned into weapons she'd use to remind me of everything I owed. My father understood things differently than most people. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, connections where others saw coincidence. I remember one Saturday morning when I was 16, he called me into his study where he kept his record collection. 3,000 albums accumulated over 30 years, each one cataloged and cared for with the kind of attention most people reserve for children. He was holding a first pressing of Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, handling it by the edges like it was made of something precious. "Always handle them by the edges, Cass," he said, showing me the proper grip. "The oils from your fingers can damage the grooves, and once they're damaged, you can't get the sound back." "Why does it matter?" I asked, teenage and dismissive. "We can just stream it. It's easier." He smiled, that patient smile he had when he was about to teach me something important. "Because some things are worth the care," he said. "Some things should last longer than convenience. They should outlive us if we protect them properly." He wasn't just talking about records. I understand that now. He was talking about legacy, about the things we choose to protect and the things we let slip away. He was talking about trust. Emily wasn't always the silent witness at her mother's table either. I remember when she was 8 years old and I was 15, she came home from school crying because a group of older girls had cornered her in the bathroom. They'd taken her lunch money and told her she was too ugly to sit with them. I found her hiding in the garden behind the house, her face buried in her knees. I sat down next to her without saying anything, just waited until she was ready to talk. When she finally told me what happened, I asked her if she knew their names. The next day, I waited outside their classroom and had a conversation they wouldn't forget. Emily never had problems with those girls again. A week later, she brought me a drawing she'd made, 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. She'd written at the bottom, "Cassie is my sister." "Why did you help me?" she asked when she gave it to me. "Mom says you don't really like us, that you wish we'd never come here." I looked at this little girl who'd lost her father, who'd been pulled into a new family, who was just trying to figure out where she belonged. "Your mom is wrong," I said, taking the drawing. "You're my sister now, Emily, and sisters protect each other." I meant it then. Every word. I wonder now if she even remembers, if that drawing is buried in a box somewhere, or if she threw it away years ago. After the funeral, I expected things to shift. I expected Tiffany to move on, maybe sell the house, start fresh somewhere without memories of hospital beds and morphine drips. Instead, she stayed, and so did I. The guilt kept me anchored like a weight I'd tied to my own ankles. Every time I thought about leaving, I'd hear her voice in my head. "I sacrificed everything for your father, everything, and you couldn't even be there when it mattered." So I paid the property taxes, I covered the utility bills when they piled up. I watched her swipe my father's credit card for shopping trips, while Emily posted vacation photos from resorts I couldn't afford. And I told myself, this was penance. This was how I made up for the hours I didn't spend at his bedside. This was family. Tiffany's logic was elegant in its cruelty. She positioned herself as the eternal martyr, the woman who gave her youth to a dying man, while his own daughter hid behind spreadsheets and client calls. The fact that she'd spent those years as a wife, not a nurse, never entered the equation. The fact that my father's life insurance had already compensated her for every sleepless nights somehow never came up. What mattered was the story she told, and she told it so often that even I started to believe it. "We're family," she'd say whenever I questioned an expense. "Your father would have wanted men to take care of Emily. She's been through so much." Emily was 20 now. She'd been through a stepfather's illness and loss, which was genuinely difficult. But she'd also been through a new car at 18, a fully furnished apartment at 19, and a wardrobe that could fill a small boutique. All funded by my father's accounts, all approved by Tiffany's signature on documents I never saw. I didn't know then that my father had seen this coming. I didn't know he'd spent his final months with lawyers and accountants, quietly building walls around the things he loved most. I just knew that something felt wrong, like living in a house where the foundation had shifted and the doors no longer closed properly. But I kept my head down. I kept paying. I kept apologizing for sins I wasn't sure I'd actually committed. Until Emily's 20th birthday. The dinner was supposed to be intimate, just family, Tiffany insisted, which meant her, Emily, a few of Tiffany's friends, and me as an afterthought. I'd spent 2 weeks finding the perfect gift, a vintage record player Emily had mentioned wanting months ago. I wrapped it carefully that afternoon, cream paper with a blue ribbon, and wrote a card that said, "For all the music you haven't discovered yet." The irony of that choice wouldn't hit me until later, until I understood what had already been taken from us. I told myself, this was family. This was what you did. You showed up and you tried. The table was set for 8 when I arrived. White tablecloth, candles, the good china my father had inherited from his mother. I walked toward my usual seat, the one I'd occupied at every family dinner since I was 13 years old. The chair where my father used to sit to my right, where we'd share quiet jokes while Tiffany talked about her day. That's when Tiffany's hand connected with my shoulder. The shove wasn't violent in the way that leaves bruises. It was calculated. Just enough force to unbalance me. Just enough witnesses to maximize the humiliation. Just enough restraint to let her claim innocence later. "That seat belongs to my actual daughter," she announced to the entire room. "You can stand by the window if you want to stay. Or don't. No one will notice either way." I looked at her, and for a moment I saw something behind her eyes, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "This has been my seat for 17 years, I said quietly. "Things change," Tiffany replied, her voice light and dismissive. "Emily needs to be surrounded by people who actually care about her, not people who show up out of obligation." "I care about her," I said. Do you? Tiffany asked, and the room went silent. Then where were you when your father was in the hospital? Where were you during those long nights when he called for you? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat, because she knew exactly which guilt to press. A woman at the table shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should," she started. "No," Tiffany cut her off smoothly. "Let's be honest for once. Cassie was always too busy for family, too important for the messy work of caring for someone who was suffering." "I paid the property taxes," I said, my voice barely steady. "Every month, without fail, I paid them." "Oh, how generous," Tiffany said with a small laugh. "Your father left you money specifically for that. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was an allowance." "He left you life insurance," I said. "That wasn't enough to compensate for what I sacrificed," she replied. "For the years I gave him, for the life I put on hold, for everything I lost taking care of a man who wasn't even my first choice." The room absorbed that statement like a stone dropping into water. I looked at Emily, my sister, the girl I'd protected from bullies and taught to be brave. She was staring at her plate, her hand adjusting her bracelet over and over, refusing to meet my eyes. She'd been my sister for 12 years, and she couldn't look at me for 12 seconds. That silence told me I needed to know. I straightened my blouse and walked toward the kitchen, not for the window seat she'd suggested, but for my coat. Tiffany followed me, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown. "Don't make a scene," she whispered when we were out of earshot. "You know how your father hated drama, how he always wanted us to keep things civil." I turned to face her, and her expression was serene, confident. The look of a woman who had spent years winning every quiet battle and expected this one to end the same way. "You will regret this," I said. Not loud, not angry, just certain. She laughed, a small, dismissive sound that made something inside me go very cold. "Regret what?" she asked. "Telling the truth?" I didn't answer. I just picked up my coat and walked out the door. I didn't look back at the table, at Emily, at the gift I'd spent 2 weeks choosing. I just left. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine and the rhythm of my own breathing. I sat in my car for 10 minutes after I parked, just sitting there, waiting for tears that never came. What came instead was clarity, cold and clean, like stepping out of a fog I hadn't realized I'd been lost in. My phone buzzed. Tiffany, then Emily, then Tiffany again. 14 times before I reached my apartment door. I turned it off and went inside. I made tea just to have something warm in my hands, the steam rising while I stared at the boxes I'd never unpacked. The temporary life I'd been living for 4 years, always waiting for permission to settle, always ready to leave if I became too much of a burden. Then I opened my laptop. Not Tovent, not to send an angry message. I opened the folder labeled Dad's Documents. For years, I'd been the one organizing his paperwork, insurance claims, tax records, correspondence with lawyers I'd never met. Tiffany had no patience for administrative details, so the job fell to me. I'd filed everything without really reading it, just sorting and storing like a good assistant. Now I read, page by page, line by line. The folder was labeled in my own handwriting, neat and careful, the handwriting of someone who thought she was just being helpful. I'd filed everything without reading, without questioning, without understanding. Now I understood. At 11:47 p.m., I found the trust document. At 11:53 p.m., I found my name listed as executor. At midnight, I understood exactly what my father had done. He'd created a testamentary trust, the house, his vintage record collection, his major assets. None of them had transferred directly to Tiffany. They were held in trust. And the executor of that trust, the person whose signature was required for any sale or transfer of those assets, was me. I read the clause 3 times to make sure I understood. Then I reached for my phone and scrolled until I found a number I hadn't called in years. Walter Chen, my father's accountant, the man who'd helped him build these walls I was only now discovering. I sent a text at 12:15 a.m. I need to meet tomorrow. It's about Dad's trust. His reply came within 3 minutes. I've been waiting for this call. Walter's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that hadn't been renovated since 1987. The carpet was industrial gray, worn thin in the paths people walked most often. The coffee smelled like it had been warming since morning, burnt and bitter. But Walter's eyes were sharp as ever, calculating, missing nothing. He was 73 now, silver-haired and deliberate in his movements. But when he looked at me across his desk, I saw the same precision my father had trusted for 30 years. Your father knew, he said without preamble, sliding a thick folder across his desk. He knew Tiffany would try to liquidate everything the moment he was gone, so he made it impossible without your consent. I opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a copy of the trust document, annotated in my father's handwriting. Sticky notes with explanations, arrows pointing to specific clauses, a letter addressed to me that I'd never received. She intercepted the original, Walter said, reading my expression. Told the attorney she'd make sure you got it. Obviously, she didn't. The letter was short, written in my father's careful script, the handwriting that had gotten shaker near the end, but was still unmistakably his. Cassie, I know I'm asking a lot by putting this responsibility on you, but you're the only one I trust to protect what matters. The house, the records, the memories of your mother that Tiffany never understood. Don't let her erase us, love. Dad. I read it 3 times, and each time, a different word broke me. First read, protect. He knew I'd need to fight, that this wouldn't be simple or clean. Second read, trust. He'd chosen me over her, even knowing I'd feel guilty, even knowing it would be heard. Third read, love, Dad, past tense. He was already gone when he wrote this, already preparing for a future he wouldn't see. My hands trembled, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of a weapon I hadn't known I was holding. There's more, Walter said quietly. What do you mean? I asked. The record collection, he said. The one your father spent 30 years building. My stomach tightened. What about it? Walter exhaled slowly, the sound of someone about to deliver news he didn't want to share. She sold it, he said. 3 months ago to a dealer in Phoenix, got about $40,000 for a collection worth at least 3 times that. The room tilted, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Those records weren't just vinyl. They were Saturday mornings. They were my father's voice, explaining why a 1959 pressing of Kind of Blue mattered more than any digital file ever could. They were the crackle and warmth of analog, the imperfections that made it real, that made it human. They were the last physical connection I had to who he was before the cancer hollowed him out, before the illness reduced him to hospital beds and morphine schedules. And Tiffany had sold them for $40,000 without a word. That sale, Walter continued, required your signature as executor. She forged it, or she convinced someone it wasn't necessary. Either way, it's a direct violation of the trust covenant. What does that mean legally? I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Walter leaned forward, his expression grave but certain. It means she committed a breach of trust, he said. And if we can prove it, she loses everything. Her claim to the estate, her authority over any remaining assets, possibly more depending on how deep this goes. I closed the folder carefully. How deep does it go? I asked. That's what we need to find out, Walter said. But Cassie, she's also trying to sell the house. I have contacts in real estate. A broker named Chad Morrison has been showing it privately for weeks. Can we get the records back? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. They're scattered, Walter said gently. Phoenix, Portland, Denver, sold to private collectors who have no obligation to return them. So they're gone, I said. The records are gone, Walter confirmed. But we can make sure she loses everything else. We can make sure she never profits from what she stole. How? I asked. Let her try to sell the house, Walter said. Then we stop her, publicly, with witnesses and documentation. We let her commit the crime, before we reveal the trap. I spent the next week becoming a ghost in my own life. I went to work, I answered client emails, I smiled at the barista who made my morning coffee. But underneath that surface, I was hunting. Monday, I pulled bank statements my father had asked me to file years ago, now revealing patterns I'd been too guilty to notice. Tuesday, I found credit card bills in my mother's maiden name, opened after her passing, maxed out on purchases Tiffany claimed were for household expenses. Wednesday, I discovered insurance policies my father had taken out, with beneficiaries quietly changed in his final months of confusion. Thursday, I found purchase receipts for jewelry Tiffany had claimed were anniversary gifts from my father, except the receipts showed her own credit card number. By Friday, I had 17 instances of unauthorized spending. By Sunday, I had a case. The more I dug, the more the picture clarified. Tiffany hadn't just taken advantage of my father's illness. She'd built an entire architecture of financial dependency. Using my guilt as the mortar that held it together, using my absence as justification for every theft. Walter connected me with an attorney named Gerald Hoffman. He was in his late 60s, soft-spoken, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like someone's kindly uncle. The kind of attorney people underestimate until it's far too late. His office was small and cluttered with case files, but his desk was immaculate, everything in its place. "How long has this been going on?" he asked after I'd finished explaining. 4 years, I said. "Since my father passed away." "And you never questioned it?" he asked, not unkindly. "I thought it was penance," I said quietly. I thought I deserved it, that I hadn't been there enough, that this was my way of making up for everything I'd done wrong. Gerald removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I'd come to learn meant he was thinking carefully. "You didn't deserve it," he said finally, replacing his glasses and looking at me directly. "And now we're going to prove that. We're going to prove exactly what she's been doing." "The breach is clear," he continued, opening the folder I'd brought. "The record sale alone is enough to challenge her position. But if we can establish a pattern of unauthorized transactions, we're looking at potential removal as any kind of beneficiary." "And the house?" I asked. "She can't sell it without your signature," he said. "Legally, any attempt to do so is void." "But she doesn't know that," I said, understanding. Gerald smiled, the slow smile of a chess player who'd just seen the board clearly. "No," he said. "She doesn't." We decided to wait, not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. Let her proceed with the sale. Let her commit fully to the transaction. Then, at the moment of closing, reveal the wall she'd been running toward all along. It wasn't revenge. It was architecture. 3 days later, I saw them together. I was driving past the house, not planning to stop, just taking the long way home out of habit. Tiffany's car was in the driveway, next to a silver BMW I didn't recognize. They were standing on the front porch, a man in an expensive coat gesturing toward the roofline, while Tiffany nodded along. Chad Morrison, the broker Walter had mentioned. I pulled over 2 blocks away, engine off, hands on the wheel. Through my rearview mirror, I watched them walk the perimeter of the property. Chad pointed at the roof, then at the garden, making sweeping gestures that probably meant renovations and potential. They paused at my mother's garden, at the irises she'd planted before I was born, the ones that had survived everything. Tiffany said something and Chad laughed, a casual sound that made my jaw clench. Then he handed her a folder, and she signed without hesitation, without reading, without any sense that she was about to commit fraud. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. She was signing away my childhood. She was erasing my father. She was selling my mother's garden. And she was doing it with a smile. I drove home and called Herald immediately. "It's happening," I said when he answered. "She's moving forward with the sale." "Good," he replied calmly. "Letter." The retaliation came faster than I expected. 4 days after the birthday dinner, I came home to find a notice taped to my door. White paper, official letterhead, legal language that blurred together until one phrase snapped into focus. Trespass warning. I read it 3 times before the words made sense. Tiffany had filed a complaint claiming I was occupying the annex without authorization. The notice demanded I vacate within 72 hours or face legal action. I stood in my doorway, reading the document over and over. The annex I'd been paying rent for, the space my father had built specifically so I'd always have a home. She was trying to make me homeless. My phone buzzed, a text from a number I didn't recognize. This is what happens when you threaten family. Pack your things, T. I screenshot the message and forwarded it to Gerald. Then I sat down on my bed and let myself feel it. The fear, the anger, the old familiar urge to apologize and make everything smooth again. But beneath all of that, something else. Relief. She'd shown her hand. She'd proven exactly what kind of person she was. And now, there was no going back. Gerald called within 20 minutes. "She's trying to evict me," I said. "Good," he replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Good?" I repeated. "She's panicking," he explained. Panicked people make mistakes. And this is a very big mistake. It creates a paper trail of harassment. "What do we do?" I asked. "We file a counterclaim," he said. "Establish your legal right to occupy the annex as the trust's executor." "How long will that take?" 24 hours, he said. "And then we wait for her to commit the second violation." "The house sale," I said. "Exactly," he confirmed. "And when she does, when she tries to close on a property she has no legal right to sell, we'll be there with documentation." I spent Saturday organizing evidence. Every forged signature in one folder, every unauthorized transaction in another. Sunday, Walter brought the record sale documents, Tiffany's signature next to mine, the forgery clumsy and obvious once you knew to look for it. "She thought you'd never check," Walter said, pointing to where she'd misspelled my middle name. "She was almost right," I replied. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of winter day that makes everything feel muted and inevitable. I dressed carefully, not for intimidation, but for clarity. A simple blouse, dark slacks, my mother's pearl earrings, the ones she'd worn on her wedding day. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who had stopped apologizing. I looked like my mother, strong, certain, unbreakable. Tiffany had tried to erase her, but I was still here. Gerald met me in the lobby of the office building where the closing was scheduled. Walter was already upstairs reviewing documents with the closing attorney. "She's here," Gerald said. "Arrived 10 minutes ago with Chad Morrison. Emily came too." "Emily," I repeated. I hadn't expected that. "Are you ready?" Gerald asked. "I've been ready for years," I said. "I just didn't know it." Gerald smiled, not unkindly. "She'll fight back," he said. "She'll say terrible things." "Let her," I replied. "I have documents. She has lies." "Then let's end this," Gerald said. "Let's," I agreed. The conference room was glass-walled and flooded with pale winter light. Tiffany sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed, her hair freshly styled, her nails immaculate. She looked like someone who'd already won, someone who'd been winning for years. Chad Morrison was beside her, shuffling papers with the confidence of someone about to earn a substantial commission. Emily sat in the corner, scrolling through her phone, already bored with the proceedings. She wore the bracelet I'd given her 3 Christmases ago, the one she'd said she loved. I wondered if she remembered. I wondered if she cared. She didn't look up when I entered. She didn't look up for the next 20 minutes. Until the moment everything changed. None of them expected me to matter. None of them thought I'd be anything more than background noise in their transaction. The closing attorney, a young woman named Sandra, welcomed everyone and began walking through the preliminary paperwork. Tiffany signed each page with practiced ease, barely reading the text, her pen moving smoothly from line to line. Chad nodded along, making small notes in the margins. I sat silently, watching, waiting. Gerald had positioned himself by the door, unassuming, holding a folder no one had asked about. When Sandra reached the final signature page, she paused. Before we proceed, she said, I need to verify executor consent for the trust-held property. Tiffany's pen stopped moving. Excuse me, she said. The property is held in a testamentary trust, Sandra said, consulting her notes. Any sale requires the signature of the designated executor. She looked up. That would be Cassandra Lee. The room went silent. Tiffany's eyes found mine for the first time since I'd walked in. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice tight. I'm the beneficiary. I have full authority. Sandra shook her head. The trust documents are quite clear, she said. The executor must consent to any transfer of major assets. There must be some mistake, Tiffany said. Tiffany's mask didn't crack all at once. It shattered in stages. There's no mistake, I said, my voice steady and calm. This was the voice of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. My father created the trust specifically to prevent unauthorized sales. You were never supposed to have the authority you've been claiming. First came confusion, her eyes darting between Sandra and Chad, looking for someone to explain how this could be happening. Then, denial. This is absurd, she said, turning to Gerald. Tell her she's wrong. Gerald stepped forward and opened his folder. Actually, he said, I'm here to tell you something else entirely. He placed documents on the table, one by one, each one landing like a stone. The trust covenant, highlighting the executor requirement. The record sale paperwork, with Tiffany's forged signature circled in red. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers. The trespass warning she'd filed against me, proving harassment. These documents establish a clear pattern of breach of trust, Gerald said. The unauthorized sale of the record collection alone is grounds for removal as beneficiary. Combined with the attempted property sale and the fraudulent use of executor authority, we're looking at potential civil liability and possible criminal referral. Then came anger. This is a setup, Tiffany hissed, her composure finally breaking. You planned this, you ungrateful, spiteful. I documented the truth, I said, cutting her off. That's all. Chad Morrison's face had gone pale. He quietly closed his folder and pushed back from the table. I was told this was a straightforward sale, he said. I had no knowledge of any trust complications. Of course you didn't, Gerald replied. Mrs. Lee made sure of that. Tiffany turned to Sandra, then to Chad, then to anyone who might offer support. No one met her eyes. And finally, desperation. You can't do this to me, she said, her voice rising. I sacrificed everything for that man. Everything. I earned this. I deserve this. You were already compensated, Walter said quietly from his corner. Your husband's life insurance, the monthly stipend built into the trust, you received exactly what he intended you to have. That wasn't enough, Tiffany shouted. That was never enough. Do you understand what I gave up for him? The room absorbed her outburst like stone absorbing rain. Gerald gathered the documents. Mrs. Lee, I'd recommend you consult with your own attorney before making any further statements. As of this meeting, the sale is void and we'll be filing formal breach of trust charges by end of business today. Tiffany stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Emily, she said, we're leaving. But Emily didn't move. She was staring at the documents on the table, at the forged signature that bore a crude approximation of my name. Mom, she said slowly, did you really forge her signature? Emily, this isn't the time, Tiffany started. Did you? Emily repeated, and the question hung in the air. Tiffany's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I did what I had to do for our family, she said. Emily looked at her mother, really looked at her, maybe for the first time. Then she looked at me, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Emily stood and walked to the far side of the room, putting as much distance between herself and Tiffany as the space allowed. I didn't know, she said quietly. I swear I didn't know. I nodded, and I believed her. She wasn't her mother. She was just someone who'd grown up in the light without questioning where the shadows fell. Tiffany's face contorted through a dozen expressions: rage, betrayal, disbelief, desperation, before settling on something that looked almost like grief. "Emily, please," she said. "Don't." Emily's voice was flat, final. "Just don't." Tiffany stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of her careful lies. Her daughter wouldn't look at her. Her stolen property was beyond reach. Her sacrifices had been revealed as calculations. And the scene she'd always warned me not to make was playing out in front of witnesses who would remember every word. I gathered my things slowly. Gerald held the door open. Walter followed behind. As I reached the threshold, Tiffany's voice came one last time, stripped of pretense. "Cassie," she said, "please, we can talk about this. We're family." I paused, not to answer, but to let the silence do what her words never could. Then I walked out. I didn't look back. The hallway stretched long and quiet ahead of me. Behind me, I could hear Tiffany's voice rising again, demanding, pleading, threatening. But it was distant now, like the hum of an old heater in a house I no longer lived in. Just noise, just the sound of someone else's desperation echoing off walls that no longer held me. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closed. And for the first time in years, I breathed without apologizing for the space I took up. 3 weeks later, the trust was officially restructured. Tiffany's claim to any remaining assets was revoked. The house stayed in my name, protected by the walls my father had built with his final months of clarity. I couldn't recover the records. They've been scattered across 3 states: Portland, Phoenix, Denver. Pieces of my father's legacy dispersed like seeds in wind, collected by strangers who would never know what they meant. But I could protect what remained, and I could finally stop paying rent on my own inheritance. Emily reached out once, a short text that arrived late on a Thursday night. "Can we talk someday?" it said. I told her I'd think about it, and I meant it. She wasn't her mother. She was just someone who'd grown up in the light without questioning where the shadows fell. I understood that. I'd been there too, believing the stories were told because questioning them feels like betrayal. Maybe someday we'd talk. Maybe someday she'd understand. But not today. As for Tiffany, I heard through Walter that she'd moved in with her sister in another state. No more luxury shopping, no more vacation posts, just the quiet unraveling of a life built on someone else's foundation. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt free. Standing in my father's garden last week, I found a patch of irises my mother had planted before I was born. They'd survived everything: the neglect, the illness, the years of being treated as backdrop to someone else's story. They were still blooming, purple and white against the dark earth. I knelt down and touched the petals, cool and impossibly soft. And I finally understood what my father had been trying to tell me in that letter. Some things are worth protecting. Some walls are built out of love. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't property or money or even memories. It's permission to stop apologizing for existing. It's the knowledge that you were worthy of protection all along. My father had built those walls not to trap me, but to give me something to stand on when the ground shifted beneath my feet. He'd known I'd need them. He'd known this day would come. And he'd trusted me to understand, eventually, what he was trying to save. If you've ever had to fight for your place at the table, I want to hear your story. What would you have done differently in my situation? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was systematically taking from you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to protect what matters from people who claimed to love you, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who never wanted to understand. Thank you for listening, and remember, the strongest roots grow in protected soil.